Did you know that some of Britain's most beloved sitcoms were penned by the legendary Roy Clarke? While most people associate him with classics like Last of the Summer Wine and Keeping Up Appearances, he was responsible for a number of lesser-known but still brilliant sitcoms that deserve just as much attention. Clarke had a talent for writing quirky, lovable characters and setting them in everyday situations that became unexpectedly hilarious. Today, we're looking at 5 of his lesser-known comedies: Rosie, Oh No, It's Selwyn Froggitt, The Misfit, Potter, and The Magnificent Evans. If you love classic British sitcoms, you might just discover a hidden gem here. So, let's start with Rosie. Now, if you're a fan of Last of the Summer Wine, this one might feel familiar. It aired from 1977 to 1981 and was actually a spin-off of The Growing Pains of PC Penrose, a short-lived series from 1975. The show follows PC Rosie Penrose, played by Paul Greenwood, a young, inexperienced police officer trying to find his feet in the small, fictional Yorkshire town of Ravensbay. Unlike the tough, no-nonsense cops you might see in dramas, Rosie is more on the soft-spoken, well-meaning, but slightly clueless side, making him an easy target for the town's more eccentric residents. His gentle nature makes for some really funny moments, especially when he's dealing with people who are much more streetwise than he is. And while the show is a comedy, it also has this warmth to it, much like Clarke's later work. It was filmed in and around Scarborough, North Yorkshire, and you can really feel the atmosphere of a quiet seaside town. If you've ever been to Scarborough, you'll probably recognise some of the locations. The show had a decent run, lasting 4 seasons, but it's not as well remembered as some of Clarke's other work. Perhaps because it didn't have the same larger-than-life characters that made his later sitcoms so iconic. Now, moving on to one of the most unusual and well-loved shows on this list. Oh No, It's Selwyn Froggitt, which ran from 1974 to 1978. If you grew up in the 70s, chances are you've heard of this one. Selwyn Froggitt, played brilliantly by Bill Maynard, is one of those well-meaning but accident-prone characters that British sitcoms do so well. He's a council labourer by day and the secretary of the local working men's club by night, but he's hopeless at both. He's always trying to prove himself, always full of ideas, and always failing in the most spectacular ways. But what made him so likeable was his optimism. He never let failure get him down. His catchphrase, magic, became something of a staple in British comedy. Although Clarke created the pilot episode, most of the series was actually written by Alan Plater, who developed the character further. It was a huge hit, with audiences loving Selwyn's slapstick mishaps and well-meaning blunders. However, when a spin-off called Selwyn was attempted in 1978, this time without Clarke or Plater's involvement, it wasn't quite as successful. Next up, we have The Misfit, which is probably the least known show on this list. It aired from 1970 to 1971 and starred Ronald Fraser as Basil Allenby Johnson, a wealthy man who, despite having inherited a fortune, struggles to fit in with upper-class society. What's great about The Misfit is that it flips the usual sitcom setup on its head. Normally, sitcoms focus on working-class characters, trying to climb the social ladder, but here we have a rich man who feels completely out of place among his so-called peers. He tries to behave in a refined, upper-class way, but his natural personality keeps coming through, leading to some brilliant moments of social awkwardness. It's almost like a forerunner to Keeping Up Appearances, where Hyacinth desperately tries to appear more refined than she actually is. The show only lasted for 2 short seasons, but it's a fascinating look at Clarke's early work, and you can really see the beginnings of his later themes, characters who don't quite belong, trying to navigate a world that doesn't make sense to them. Now, let's talk about Potter, which ran from 1979 to 1983 and starred Arthur Lowe, who, of course, was best known as Captain Mannering in Dad's Army. Lowe plays Redvers Potter, a retired sweet manufacturer who, instead of enjoying his retirement, spends all his time interfering in everyone else's business. He's one of those people who thinks he knows best about everything, whether it's community affairs, other people's problems, or even how his wife should organise the house. Naturally, this leads to a lot of hilarious situations, especially when people don't take too kindly to his meddling. One of the most interesting things about Potter is how each episode usually ends with him having a conversation with the local vicar, reflecting on what's happened. If that sounds familiar, it's because the Vicar of Dibley used a very similar format, with the vicar ending each episode by chatting with Alice. Clarke loved using these reflective moments to tie up the episode's themes while still delivering a final punchline. The show had 2 series, but sadly sadly, when Arthur Lowe passed away in 1982, Potter couldn't continue. It was later revived in 1983 with Robin Bailey in the lead role, but it didn't have the same charm without Lowe's performance. And finally, we have The Magnificent Evans, which aired in 1984 and starred the legendary Ronnie Barker as Plantagenet Evans, an eccentric Welsh photographer. Evans is a larger-than-life character, full of himself, completely convinced of his own genius, and entirely oblivious to how ridiculous he looks to everyone else. He has a stormy, flirtatious relationship with his assistant, Rachel, played by Sharon Morgan, who is probably the only person who can put him in his place. The show is full of Barker's signature wordplay and over-the-top delivery, making it a real treat for fans of classic British comedy. However, The Magnificent Evans only lasted for one series. It's not entirely clear why, but some believe it was because the show didn't quite fit the usual sitcom formula. The humour was more character-driven than plot-driven, and Barker himself later admitted that he didn't think the show was one of his best. Still, it's a fascinating watch, and Barker's performance alone makes it worth seeking out. So, there you have it. 5 Roy Clarke sitcoms that you might not have heard of before. While they may not be as famous as Last of the Summer Wine or Keeping Up Appearances, they all showcase Clarke's signature humour, his love of eccentric characters, and his knack for finding comedy in the everyday. Whether it's a bumbling policeman, a well-meaning fool, or an interfering retiree, Clarke had a way of making ordinary people hilariously entertaining. If you're a fan of classic British sitcoms, these shows are definitely worth checking out. Which of these have you seen? And are there any other hidden gems from Roy Clarke's career that deserve more recognition? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into classic British comedy. Thanks for watching.
Can you imagine your hoodie menu and then 3 houses of bingo magic?